Astronomy and Obstetrics and Astro-Psychology, backtracking the boundaries of science. G'day, I'm Warbles on a lot, and I might be the fool on the hill, and maybe I'm a mad scientist too, but there's a particular sacred cow that I'd like to have a bit of a go at, and it involves scientific problem-solving method, it involves astronomy, it involves astrology, it involves psychology, and it involves obstetrics. I'm sure you're familiar with the idea that astronomy involves studying the sky with telescopes, and telescopes have been around for 400 to 600 years, depending on your argument as to who invented them. You could even say the Chinese had them 1,000 years before that, but astronomy involves studying the sky with telescopes. And every astronomer with a grip on history will admit that astronomy got its start in a much older school of thought called astrology. Now, whereas the astronomers study the night sky with telescopes and they magnify the view before thinking about it, the astrologers study the night sky with naked eyeballs. And the naked eyeball astrologers, they teach that there are 12 basic types of human personality. And it doesn't matter whereabouts you go on planet Earth, the indigenous people have got a 12 personality type astrological system of thinking. More or less simultaneously, the Babylonians and the Chinese developed sun sign astrology, say 5,000 years ago. And while that makes them fairly old as schools of thought go, you've got to bear in mind that the Australian rainbow serpent is a continuously practiced form of religious or spiritual belief that's been around for 10,000 years, and the Australian Aborigines have a system of astrology as well, 12 personalities. Now, I don't pretend to be any expert on astrology, but I know the American Indians, both north and south, they also worked out astrological systems. And I would have to say that the major difference between the pre-telescope stargazers and the post-telescope stargazers is that the pre-telescope stargazers used to use a lot of guesswork, and the post-telescope stargazers, they try to limit the amount of guesswork to a tolerable amount. They use a thing called scientific method of problem solving. I first struck scientific method of problem solving when I was in high school. It involves being curious enough to make an observation, to notice something that's interesting, then to develop an hypothesis to perhaps explain the interesting observation. And beware, the number of possible hypotheses to explain any given observation is officially infinite. If you think you're going to have trouble with that, go and read Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance by Robert M. Pirsig. It may be of assistance. Having discarded the unlikely hypotheses, the scientist comes up with a theory to explain the observation, and the theory must be capable of making a prediction, and the prediction must be testable. Then the scientist conducts an experiment to test the theory and evaluates the result. Scientific method of problem solving. Teach it in the high schools, not that difficult. As a matter of fact, the second time I encountered scientific problem solving method, it was a pirated copy by the Australian Nursing Federation and the New South Wales Nurses Association. It was called The Nursing Process, and it goes assess, plan, implement, evaluate. Scientific method of problem solving with the serial number filed off and given a new coat of paint. Which goes to show you that two different sciences with two different vocabularies describing two different phenomena may in fact dovetail. They may be complementary. That's almost part of the definition of science. If you add biology to chemistry, you don't get warfare in the streets, you get biochemistry. One of the definitions of religion is that they tend not to mix well. If you add Christianity to Islam, you often get war on the streets. Okay, we're 4.5 minutes in. By now, none of the scientists are disagreeing, and none of the astrologers are disagreeing, and none of the psychologists are disagreeing, and none of the obstetricians are disagreeing. So we're doing well. First point of surprise for the scientific community. All the systems of astrology are complementary and they dovetail. If you're born in February, the Australian Aborigines will call you a wedge-tailed eagle and describe a particular kind of personality. The Chinese will call you an ox and they'll describe the same type of personality. And the Babylonians will call you an Aquarian and they will describe the same kind of personality. The Chinese noticed that there was a 12-yearly cycle, so they might call somebody an ox, meaning they've been born in the month of the ox as well as in the year of the ox, and they make arcane calculations as to what effect that has on the individual's personality and therefore their propensity for behaving in a particular way under certain circumstances. If you add Babylonian-Astrology to Chinese-Astrology and see what happens when you get an Aquarian ox, for example. If you've ever heard the Man from Snowy River, written by a bloke called Banjo Patterson, he was married in the next town north from here, a place called Tenterfield. He was born on a particular day in February in a year of the ox. I was born on the same day of the same month in a year of the ox. I too am a loudmouth alcoholic poet, championing the left-wing causes of Australia. Somebody with a science degree from a university would say that's a pure coincidence, just absolute flaming coincidence. Somebody who gets into astrology would say, well, of course, you know, that's the day that Australia throws up its left-wing alcoholic poets. So the situation is that for probably 400 or 500 years, the self-styled scientific atheists or scientists, they've been pouring buckets of scorn and contempt on all of the astrologers because the scientific point of view is that there's no possible mechanism by which a planet millions of miles away can affect an individual's personality, and the psychiatrists say there are more than 12 kinds of personality in the world anyway. So, okay, what's going on? Where did this have its beginnings? Well, it's a funny thing, but the natural history of human reproduction involves, under conditions where the moon is the brightest thing in the nighttime sky, all the women on the world ovulate within 24 hours of each other when the moon is full. This means that everybody looks their best by moonlight when the bedroom is softly but evenly lit. And when all the women are ovulating and they're horny, if they're sleeping with a man, men respond to the pheromones of any ovulating woman, while women respond to the pheromones of a man with a different immune system. And they won't sleep with him if he smells yucky. So, once upon a time, before the Babylonians invented oil lamps, when the moon was full, all the women who were not lactating or pregnant were ovulating and horny. If they were sleeping with a man, they had sex. If there was nothing wrong with the plumbing, they got pregnant. This is a system which meant that the women bred the men for hybrid vigour of the immune system of the resulting fetus, and it also meant that the midwife could see where to go at night time walking between the campfires because the full moon lit her way as well. It also meant that the midwife was awake at sunrise in order to note the sunrise position in a different constellation with each different monthly crop of babies, and there were in fact 13 crops of babies in a year because there's 13 full moons. So there we have it. We just shot down 500 years worth of scientific dogma. The point is that is it difficult to expect one crop of babies being born into a different seasonal situation and condition to be more like each other than they are with the previous crop or the following crop? I don't think it's that difficult a stretch of the imagination at all whatsoever. Once upon a time, there were 12, 13 crops of babies every year, and each crop was different, and the crops had fairly reliably predictable personality traits. Immediately the scientists are going to freak out and say, what's your mechanism, what's your mechanism? How can the position of the sun in a constellation on the horizon on the day you're born affect anything? And the answer is it doesn't. It doesn't affect jack shit. What matters is what's going on 9 months, 10 months earlier during spermatogenesis, and when the woman's body is going through the remaining primary oocytes. When she was born, each little girl has 5,000 primary oocytes in the left ovary, 5,000 different ones in the right ovary, and each month, depending on the pheromones of the man that she's smelling and the men that she's fantasising about, she goes through the filing cabinet and picks out some primary oocytes that would be good for making an ovum, that would be good for being fertilised by this, that or the other man that she's with at the time. At that same moment in time, men are producing the sperm. That's when the changes happen. At least in my opinion. Okay, so now we've got these two bunches of opinions, schools of thought, diametrically opposed to each other for hundreds of years. How did the schism come apart? And in my opinion, again, it was the oil lamp. It was the Babylonians with their oil lamp. And before the Babylonians had oil lamps, they developed their religion, and in their religion the moon was called Ishtar. And Ishtar, the moon goddess, went and hid in a cave when she had her menstrual period. And everybody knew Ishtar had her menstrual period because all the Babylonian women were menstruating, and when menstruating women hear men making a noise, they quite often become cranky. So the men would down tools for 5 days. They called the time period Sarbat. When the moon goddess was menstruating, the Babylonian men had a holiday for 5 days because nobody wants to irritate a menstruating moon goddess. That's the part one. Part two, the Babylonians used to make naked eye telescopes. Their naked eye telescopes consisted of tall posts in the ground. And the idea was to wait until nearly sundown and then particularly set your eyes on one planet and stand where you have to stand to line up the planet's first visible position in the sky with the top of the post, and then drive a peg in the ground and take measurements and do drawings and develop all kinds of theories of celestial spheres in order to explain why the planets move across the ecliptic, and therefore you have to stand in a different position every day at sunset to align your eyeball with where the planet is today. So, the taller the tower, the more accurate the Babylonian telescope. And when they captured some savages in the wilderness and put them on the construction gangs, the savages couldn't speak with any of the other construction crew members because they all had different languages, they were all captives. This happened at a time when the Babylonians had been irrigating their agriculture for 100 years or so, maybe a few hundred years. And the water they irrigated with was too salty, and they salted their fields, and their civilization collapsed. And the construction slaves left with the story of the Tower of Babel and oil lamps. And they took Sarbat and cut it into equal pieces. And they had 1 day of rest every week because their god told them to do it differently. Of course, it was the richest of the people who could afford to burn the midnight oil and keep their women desynchronised. And therefore it was the educated and the rich people whose lifestyles were disconnected from the natural flow of rhythms of life within the world. And it became fashionable to look down on the peasantry who still believed in astrology and other quaint superstitious customs. One of the things that I did read once upon a time, probably in a New Scientist or some other equally reliable source, was that if you put them in the presence of bright lights, a woman's first fallback position is to fall back on the pheromones and synchronise her ovulation with that of the dominant woman within the household. Which is why all the girls in the boarding school dormitory are horny at the same time, or they're cranky at the same time, and the same goes for army barracks. In ancient times, when there were no bright lights, it meant that all the women in the world were horny, or all the women in the world were cranky, and no one woman had a survival advantage over any other woman, and no one of them could steal anybody else's husband by virtue of being ovulating and horny and giving off pheromones. A pretty good system, really. However, if you isolate the women one to each household and you give them a bright light, their tertiary fallback system is the phase of the moon on the day they were born. And as far as I can tell, round about the time telescopes came in, that was around about the time the Europeans, or landless ignorant peasant from Europe, comes, they were killing all the whales in the ocean, and they had beautiful bright whale oil candles, and they were just starting to get onto sophisticated lamps, or elegant lamps, well-designed lamps. So that's when they desynchronised their women. On a really large scale, when deficit finance took off, and let's face it, it was the Babylonians who invented deficit finance, and it destroyed their local ecology too. So ever since the Babylonians salted their fields attempting to grow enough feed to keep their cities running, because they built a big city because of their deficit finance, and they didn't have any fallow years, and they tried to harvest 11 times in 10 years. Every god theory on the planet has been teaching against usury, or the charging and payment of interest. So apparently, as part of their systematised campaign to put down all forms of god theory, it's the economists and the scientists, the scientific atheists, who've been poo-pooing astrology or astro-psychology because the scientific atheists were too disconnected from the natural rhythms of life to know what in the fucking hell they were talking about. Okay, so that's a sacred cow with its throat neatly cut, and I'll go on to discuss the implications of this global system in another video. Ciao! Astronomy and Obstetrics, Astro-Psychology, backtracking the boundaries of science.